Today, the nanny state property bubble. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I'm joined again by journalist Tarric Brooker. Hi Tarric.
G'day Martin, how are you?
Pretty good. Another Friday, another crazy week. You know, it's wherever you look, there's craziness around, isn't there?
Oh, there is. Well, I mean, I guess at least we've got the week behind us, so to speak, you know. But, you know, it all never really ends, does it? There's always something.
Yeah, and did you see the the latest is that everybody is saying, oh no, we need more property market support. You know, we need tax free construction, right, to help build yet more construction. For example, we need to open the borders so we can bring more migrants in to feed the Ponzi scheme. I mean, the property thing is taking over.
Well, I mean, I suppose it has taken over, hasn't it? You know, you look at government policy, you look at regulatory policy. So much of it is just targeted at the property market, and it just leads you sort of to wonder, well, where does it all end?
Well, the question is, when is property too expensive, right? Because if you look at what's happened, we've got the acceleration in prices at the moment. Now, we know that more and more people are putting more and more of their incomes to buy property. And of course, the argument is, well, things are more affordable because rates are a lot lower than they were. How long they stay low is an interesting debate. But, you know, you've got to ask, this trajectory of prices growing so much faster than wages, and it's been growing for such a long period of time, you know, what is the end game here? You know, how high will they go?
Well, that's something that Alex Joyner and Shane Oliver have both raised recently in the media. You know, just saying that basically we're running on the last of the rocket fuel underneath the property market at this point, because we've had, you know, the population growth, we've had the rate cuts, you know, the improving affordability, which I don't think many people would consider it all that much more affordable, but, you know, each to their own. But it really just, there's not that much left in the tank in the grand scheme of things. I mean, like, maybe we get another year, 2 years worth of strong growth out of this until finally we just hit this upper point where you just can't inflate it anymore without throwing yet another source of fuel on the fire.
Well, stand back and look over the last 30 years, right? So there are 3 or 4 reasons why property is where it is. Firstly, we had the deregulation of the financial system, of course, which brought more people in. Then we had the reduction of lending standards, which allowed the banks to lend a lot more to a lot more people. Then we had the migration flows, which have been quite strong over recent years, and that's put more fuel on the demand side. And then, of course, with interest rates dropping, you know, the Reserve Bank chopped them, and recently chopped them really hard. The question is, what more levers are there? Well, a bit of more government stimulus, you know, 95% mortgages and what have you. It's interesting, in the UK, by the way, they just announced a 5% scheme, a bit like we had here, where effectively the government guarantees the difference between 80 and 95% to bring more first-time buyers in. So this isn't just a local problem, this is a global problem, right? But I do put it right back to those fundamental structural changes in the financial system. And of all the relationships between prices and everything else, right, the strongest one is credit availability. That's the one that's driving it. That's what's driven it. The question is, how much more available can you make credit than it is now?
Well, one of the things that really gets me just talking about credit availability is you read these articles in the Australian Financial Review or in the other, the sort of other prominent, mainstream finance press, and you read these the quotes from these economists, and they say the RBA can't raise rates without it impacting the economy basically just horribly, because there are so many people who are heavily indebted that it's going to just, stifle the economy. Disproportionately is the word I'm looking for. Even though, one of the things I find fascinating is, I did the math on APRA's number recently, and the total savings between the beginning of the rate cut cycle in March last year and January this year, it only saved Aussie households about $8 billion. Now, I know I'm saying only $8 billion, it sounds still sounds like a whole heap of money, but it's only like about 0.4% of GDP. Yet it's had an absolutely disproportionate impact on housing prices. For 0.4% of GDP, in some areas you've seen housing prices rise 20 or 30%. So there's this really outsized impact of rate cuts on the property cycle on the way up. But then you also have to ask, as you mentioned on Twitter recently, if it's good for rate cuts if rate cuts for 1% of the cash rate drive property prices 30% higher, what's a rate rise of 1% or even 0.5% going to do to property prices?
Yeah, well, Peter Chiddock's modelling when it was the RBA was quite clear. Of course, they don't really take full account of credit in their modelling, which I have a fundamental problem is. But if rates were to rise, that would be an absolute disaster for many people. And of course, Peter Chiddock's now arguing for more high-rise development close into town. That will solve the housing problem, right? No, it won't. We've got 1.2 million spare properties already. And the point I want to keep making is all of these discussions about prices going up, it's mostly standalone houses, right? It is not apartments. If you look at apartment markets pretty much everywhere, oversupply, poorly constructed, of course, as well. And a lot of property investors in houses may be holding on, but property investors holding units are definitely now running to the exits. I'm seeing quite high intention to list amongst those property investors. A lot of them are sitting on these units where they can't actually get anybody to rent them now. Rents are on average still significantly down. So again, we have this sort of top level noise about everything's fine in the property market. No. Everything's fine in certain segments of the market, particularly houses, but the unit sector is all over the place. And if you look at rental returns on a net basis, most units are really struggling at the moment. So there's some really, really critical issues now coming to a head. And, you've got to ask the question, can rates go really lower than where they are? Of course, some of the banks have now started to move some of their longer term rates a little higher. We also know that recently some first time buyers have been able to get into the market thanks to looser underwriting. But of course, the other factor that's really driven that is the bank of mum and dad. And I shared some statistics with you just to highlight how critical that is. More than half of first time buyers got help from their parents to buy. That's pretty remarkable, and it makes the bank of mum and dad within the top 10 lenders in Australia.
Well, I've actually got an article on that coming out this weekend, based on your data, which, thanks, cheers for that. And it's just fascinating. I mean, 61% of first home buyers, I believe was the latest number in your data, that are receiving help from their parents at an average level of almost $90,000 each. And, I mean, it really just makes you wonder how many parents are there out there that can realistically give their children, especially if they've got more than one child, $90,000 a pop. I mean, it's nuts.
Well, it is, sibling equity is an interesting question, right? There's no doubt in my mind that, if you've got 2 or 3 kids and you give them each, I'd say $100,000 to round it up, I mean, that's a big chunk of equity, right? Now, it's interesting, if you look at the trends, there was a dip in the activity in the bank of mum and dad when prices came off, because suddenly the mum and dads were a bit concerned about what their property prices were going to do and wanted to make sure they had sufficient to be able to actually take them into later life. But with all the acceleration, particularly in houses, they suddenly feel much more flush, and therefore they want to help their kids get into the market. The kids, of course, are very, very grateful. Quite often, those same kids are also accessing super as part of it, accessing the government schemes as part of it. So they're being helped left, right, and centre. And I don't know whether you recall, one of the things that I highlighted in the analysis is that if you look in the subsequent 5 years, people who got help from the bank of mum and dad are 3 times more as likely to default because they haven't had the experience of saving, right? They've had this seagull clunk, here you go buy a property, and it doesn't actually work very well. So that's the historic data. We're interested to see what happens this time. It really can be creating a whole bunch of pressures there, and of course pressures also on the parents. Quite often these deals are not well structured, so it's not clear whether it's a loan or a gift, not sure whether interest is being paid or not sure whether the thing is going to be paid back or not. And as you say, if you've got 2 or 3 kids, you can do that for each of them. So there's a bunch of really significant questions. And by the way, it's often not very well documented either.
No, and it speaks to just such a crazy level of systemic risk of just, it's all well and good while property prices are rising, as you said, from sort of mid 2019 onwards, you saw this reversal in the fortunes of the bank of mum and dad. But it really does raise the question of the good times never roll forever. Now, I know that the government is probably going to continue to intervene and do all sorts of, well, who knows? I can only speculate on what they could possibly concoct. But it just, if this does keep going, and you do see more and more people, taking out a mortgage or a reverse mortgage or any other, all these other various things, because they're obviously all, legions of demographic issues that we're having. People these days, will struggle because a lot more of them are retiring with debt. Back in the old days, it was just like, oh, here's some money from mum and dad's super. They did fine. They're on easy street. But these days, people are retiring with debts. They're taking out reverse mortgages to help their children. And I mean, and as you say, like I've been on some of these first home buyer, social media groups, and it's really concerning seeing like just how ambiguously a lot of these things are being put together. And you put together this just concerning level of ambiguity with the vast number of people who are creating these types of arrangements, and it really does make you wonder, well, what if something does go wrong? Like people and money, when things go wrong, just that doesn't go too well, to say the least.
Yeah, and one of the ones that is often not thought about is what happens if the kids in a relationship, they buy the house together and then the relationship breaks down, for example. That's one that people don't think through. And then the other is what happens if if they can't pay the mortgage, do they then come back and ask for more money?
Anecdotally, that's what I've seen on quite a few occasions.
Oh, yes.
I remember someone. I'm not gonna give too many clues so they don't know who they are. But I remember they got a big loan from their parents for the deposit, and they got themselves into trouble on an investment property, and then it all fell to bits. They became one in the it's about 1 in 10 of these bank of mum and dad borrowers end up defaulting. Was it?
Yeah, give or take, that's about right. Over a 5-year period, and it does vary, but they're just more likely to because they haven't had the experience of managing their finances and the discipline of saving. And that's okay. That the parents will bail me out again if I get into difficulty. That's the attitude, and there is a sort of a, well, can I say? I'm going to say this. There's an intergenerational question here, right? A lot of young people feel they deserve a property. And so they actually feel that they deserve to get some of that money from their parents because their parents have done so well, because property has gone through the roof. So they feel it's quite within their means to expect that to come to them, right? That's the first point. The second is that some parents feel under huge pressure to actually provide this. Now, if you've got parents who are able to do it, great, but what about those who haven't? And that creates now this not only an intergenerational divide, but also a have and a have not divide. And that's the one that really worries me, because we keep coming back to this, Tarric, when we talk about this, that there's a proportion of the population doing quite well, thank you, but there's also a proportion of the population not doing that well at all. And this is yet another example. If you don't have rich parents, you can't buy a property.
It is, and I think not to throw too much fuel on the fire as I often do, but like people ask me about well, what's the positive scenario in all of this, and it's like you say, there's a plenty positive scenario in there depending on who you are. If you're the holder of assets, if you're the holder of multiple properties in areas which are being favoured by demographic changes due to the pandemic, things like work from home, or just basically the government just throwing money at people to go buy properties or build properties, then yeah, it's great. Things are fantastic. Things are very, very positive. But the other side of that positive scenario is that the people who don't have properties or don't have rich parents and don't have these things to give them a leg up, they end up with well, I'm not going to say that. They end up with, stuff all. And, so that's the problem. There are positive scenarios. There are many, many different positive scenarios depending on who you are. If you're part of the 1%, chances are most of them favour you. But if you're on the bottom end of the K, as we talk about, the wealthy, than the not so wealthy, then it's a very different story. And I think that's what's a little bit frustrating at times, because there is no scenario in which everybody wins. That scenario is gone. It is dead and buried. It's been dead and buried for a long, long time. All you've got to do is look at the census data in terms of home ownership or the number of homeless people. All these issues have exploded over the last 15 or 20 years. And, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news. I wish I could come to you every week and say, this is all fantastic. We've housed this many homeless people. This many young people have got into affordable housing and are now going to use the additional disposable income to build a business. It's going to create jobs. But that's not what is happening. And it's not really in me to lie about these things.
No, I think it's very important that it's called out, because unfortunately that quiet minority, and actually I've got this view that there are two quiet minorities that actually don't get enough airplay. There's the younger group, the ones that don't have the parental support and are really struggling into the property market and those sorts of things. The other are the older generation, right, who are struggling now with lower term deposit rates and really trying to work out how to make ends meet, right? So you've got these two groups that together probably make up more than a third of the population. And then you've got this lump in the middle, which are actually doing quite well. And unfortunately, all of the political messaging is targeted at the ones that are actually in the middle. There's probably more than 50% there, so probably from a voting perspective, it might make sense. But they're falling off the log either end.
They are. And that's one thing that really frustrates me at times, because I've been interviewing these people and talking to these people now for over a decade, since just after the financial crisis, both on a personal level and a professional level. And it's just insane watching the number, especially like looking at the demographic breakdown of the people on New Start, or Job Seeker as they now call it, the number of older women who are then, falling into homelessness, who are then having all of these enormous, social issues as a result of not being able to make ends meet, who are stuck on these things long term, because they're too young for a pension because they've raised the age, who are stuck, doing, paying $50 a week to go for their work for the dole job. And I talk to these people, and, I'd say probably 90% of them are there through no direct fault of their own. And I know this is a bit controversial at times with some of the viewers, but these people need help. We can't just leave them there with what they have, and it creates all these various different social problems. And I mean, like, there was an article in the ABC the other day, about them not having enough space in domestic violence shelters, and then they try and get these women with children out of these shelters, because it's no real environment to raise a child a lot of the time, and they just want to get them into a rental property. But because the cost of living has just exploded, they really struggle in a lot of places, and this is becoming a systemic issue, particularly in regional areas whereby you could have got a couple with a woman with some kids easily into some temporary accommodation for $250, $300 a week before, but now, because of the exodus from the city, they're struggling to get these women and these kids any help at all in terms of getting them out of these shelters. And it's just a shame, because we make this big song and dance in the media, women this, women that, and yes, it's incredibly important, but just talking about it doesn't do anything. The government actually needs to step up and actually do something.
Well, it's interesting. I think you've touched on a very important question, which is, what is society for? Right? I mean, it seems to me, and maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned here, but I believe that society should be for the greater good of everybody, not just a proportion of society, right? And that we should actually be looking after those who are less able and less fortunate, because they actually are still part of the community, right? And therefore the community's direction and trajectory should be actually centered on making sure that everybody's roughly marching in the right direction. Where it seems to me what we've actually got is a proportion of the population saying, whoopee, property, let's go buy some more property, right? We're rushing ahead, and we're just leaving all of these people by the wayside. politicians don't think they're important because they don't have much of a voice and their votes probably don't count that much. So they focus on this other message, right, which is, I suppose neoliberalism, to call it one thing. And then the result of that, we've created this massive cavern between, or crevasse between, the two. Unfortunately, I don't feel much inclusiveness at the moment.
No, and I know some people get annoyed when I talk about this stuff about government intervention in certain things, but to be completely honest, one of the key underlying problems, particularly here in Australia, is that these issues a lot of the time are not created by government intervention. They're not created organically. They're not just occurring if the government wasn't undergoing its current actions, they wouldn't be happening to the degree that they are. I mean, there are various studies that show as housing prices skyrocket, so does homelessness. And that's really the crux of the issue in all of this, and it's the crux of the title of this video. Because if we didn't have the nanny state government protecting the property market, protecting, the what shall we call them diplomatically, protecting the sort of beneficiaries of the status quo, we wouldn't have the degree of the problems that we have today now. If if we didn't deregulate lending, even if we just had the most basic level of lending standards, say for example, we had just adopted the 4.5 times debt to income ratio in the UK, which is, hardly an enormous break on housing prices. I mean, you just got to look at the UK housing prices over the last, 12 months. But in our environment, it would be enough to slam the brakes on, because, people here borrow 6, 7, 8 times income as a matter of, today's Friday. And that's the crux of the issue. It's not the fact that these issues are occurring organically. And it's not like I'm saying that we need to just get out there and throw all this money at these problems straight away. What we need to do is stop the government from interfering in things and distorting the market and distorting our society. Then just take a step back and just go, what do we need to solve these problems? And then, as a society, we can all get together, give our input, and we can talk about what we should do, rather than just the crap show that we have now.
Well, that's right. So state and federal governments have thrown billions and billions of dollars for a long, long time. The regulators, of course, have basically made it easier and easier for banks to lend more and more. And of course, the banks are the winners, right? Because their books continue to grow, and the banks are supported by very cheap funding from the Reserve Bank so that they can lend even more. So we've got that mechanism in train as well. And then we've got this other issue, which is that we're seeing people with mortgages for more of their life. We mentioned reverse mortgages later on. And in fact, I've got this view that we're getting close now to the point where most people with a mortgage are just like renting. They actually never will actually repay the capital, right? So they've actually created a super class of renters. It's just that they're called people who are paying their mortgage to the bank, right? But they were doing that for most of their life. And of course, in Japan, for example, they've got 100-year mortgages. Well, maybe that's the way we're going. It doesn't help. It doesn't actually solve anything. All it's doing is creating a bigger asset bubble, bigger debt, and creating a greater divergence between the haves and the have-nots. Now, it's all because of stupid manipulation, implementation, and frankly, manipulation by the people that should have known better but haven't. And the other interesting question is, both the Reserve Bank and APRA say, house prices have nothing to do with us. We just do other things. So my question is, so where does accountability for house prices and their trajectory actually lay? Because at the moment, it seems to me that everybody's doing this wonderful trick of saying it's over there somewhere.
Well, that's what politicians have been doing for a long time. They go to the election and they say, housing affordability is so important. It's very important that, that people be able to, get into a property and have a family and do all these things. And then a journalist will ask them, well, how are you going to do that? Oh, we've got this first home loan scheme. We've got this scheme. We've got that scheme. We've got this subsidy. But the truth is if you want affordable housing in this environment with this level of wage growth, there's only one way to get it. And that's falling prices. And that's political kryptonite. At least it's apparently political kryptonite. That's what they believe it is. But it just speaks to, like, once again, it speaks to the nanny state, type existence our property market enjoys, rather than having, this free market that the Liberal Party, they want a free market for everything. It's like, oh, well, there's too much regulation in this, there's too much government intervention there. It's like, well, what about the property market? Oh, no, can't touch that.
Well, that's right. Now, some skeptical people might say, I wonder how many politicians have multiple investment properties, and could that be shading their attitudes at all? And I'll just leave that as a hanging question because it's quite hard to know. But I can tell you that quite a few pieces of data that I've seen suggest that politicians are right up there in terms of multiple investment properties. So that's the first point. The second point is you've got to understand where the money goes. And, I always say follow the money. Think about the amount of support that the political parties get from the construction sector, from the finance sector, and elsewhere. Not surprising, perhaps, that they have a very significant voice in terms of influencing what goes on. And people like the HIA and the real estate industry are absolutely always all over this, calling for more support, right? And home builders is a great example of that, right? In terms of yes, another example of throwing more money where it probably didn't need to go to create a problem whereby we now have too many buildings that need to be built relative to the number of people who can build them and the resources that are available. So they now have to extend it. I mean, this is another example of absolute stupidity. And of course, it goes back to tactical, short-term, politically probably might be okay because you're going to impact the right sector of the market and the right voters. But strategically, it's an absolute nightmare. And yet this financialization of property, this overemphasis on property, this over-politicalization of property is, for me, I think, actually getting terminal. And by the way, I'd also make the point that the other side of politics aren't much better either, because they're both singing from the same hymn sheet on this. It's time for a different way of thinking, I think, about this whole area.
I'm just trying to think of the last time the government actually implemented a strategic policy, to be completely honest with you.
Is that an oxymoron? I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, I suppose in a way in the modern world it sort of is, but, I mean, I'm not, a huge fan of everything that Biden is doing in the US, and I think that he's making some worse than Trump mistakes in some cases, but I got to hand it to him that he at least has a vision for the future. I may not agree with all of it, but at least he's putting something forward. But, here in Australia, it's like, oh, well, we're going to have gas, we're going to have coal, and we're going to have property, and that's pretty much it. And there's no real, there's really nothing else. That's all we have. And I think that's really sad, to be honest. Like, I kind of wish that, when you got into politics, you automatically just got given shares in Aussie startups and you ended up funneling the money their way rather than into the property market. We probably have our own Silicon Valley by now. Instead, we've just got, crappy estates in the middle of nowhere where you listen to your neighbour Bob peeing at 3 a.m. because it's made like crap.
Yes. And, I was looking the other day at the number of properties still being built, right? And it's going through the roof, right? In those high growth corridors, right, which is what they call them. And there was an interesting report in the ABC recently saying, all these high growth corridors have nothing else. There's no facilities, there's nothing else other than houses mile after mile after mile, right? And that's the problem. You're creating really poor quality areas, poor quality living, a long way out from anywhere, and yet it's just turning the handle on yet more and more and more. And if only some of the money was pointed at innovation and as you say, startups and small businesses, we could have a very different shaped economy. But no, it's all about that housing construction complex. That's the only game in town, well, other than just digging up some iron ore and selling it to China.
One of the things that I just find really a little bit disturbing about Australia is that how accepting we are of the brain drain, of our best and brightest heading off to Europe or America or wherever it is in pursuit of their dreams or a job in one of these sort of high tech fast moving fields, because here we don't have the government policy for it. We don't have the taxation policy for it. We don't have the incentives for it. Yet despite all of their various failings as a nation, the Americans just tread all over us when it comes to that. And not a month goes by that I don't hear of someone, planning to. I mean, before COVID, it was them leaving, but now it's just planning to leave, or once their business reaches a certain level, they're just like, no, I'm taking this to a venture capitalist in the US or in Germany or somewhere like that, because I just can't get the funding here, because people, it's just neither here nor there, because everyone's just so obsessed with the property market. The capital is just so misallocated.
Yep. No, I've had quite a few conversations in recent months with entrepreneurs here in Australia that are tearing their hair out trying to get any funding they can. And the only solution is to sell their idea overseas. And as you say, go over there and make it happen. And that's not good for us here in Australia. And I must say that the latest spin with regards to clean energy isn't necessarily going to actually turn that around, right? We're not seeing the investment that we should be seeing on so many fronts. And we're just getting a more and more narrow economy, property, more property, yet more property, and the financing debt on the back of it. And then a bit of digging some stuff out the ground and flogging it overseas. But that's not really a mix of an economy that's really going to be sustainably vibrant in the long term. And it goes right back to what I said about, what's society? What is Australia about? It should be more than that.
It should. And like you just say about, the sort of, shall we say, stagnant nature of the vibrancy and the momentum of the economy. It just speaks to the issue that we're going to experience in the years to come, because everyone right now is just there's just this wave of euphoria spreading through the nation. You've got all these various confidence indices at decade highs. You've got services and composite PMIs to the moon and all this other stuff going on. But it's because it takes time for stimulus to feed through the economy. It doesn't just stop the day that JobKeeper stops. You still see something like about, depending on the research, and depending on who you talk to, the stimulus takes about almost a year, sometimes over a year to feed through. So you get this big burst at the start, and then you get about another sort of 30 to 40% spread out over the next sort of 12, sometimes 18 months. It really just depends on the research. And that speaks to where we are in Australia here, because we haven't experienced all these same things as the rest of the world, with the exception of Victoria. We haven't had the same degree of lockdowns. We haven't had the same degree of problems. So the government's basically just thrown all of this money. I think Alan Kohler at the New Daily wrote a good article about it about a week ago. And he called it, stimulus overkill. And he's like, basically, well, the economy's doing well. It's because you threw all this money at it. You threw 17% of GDP at an economy that needed help for about 3 weeks. And, after that, everything was relatively okay, with the exception of a few outbreaks here and there. And obviously with the vast exception of Victoria during its months-long lockdown.
Yeah, well, certainly so far we've got away relatively scot-free, although, of course, the migration of the virus is still going on. We've got various variants of it around the world, and we're still wrestling, of course, with the vaccine rollout here. And we still get the occasional escape from hotel quarantine. So, I think, we should be a little bit cautious before we celebrate too early. We may have won one of the battles, but I'm not sure we've actually won the war yet.
I don't think the war's going to be over for quite a long time, to be completely honest with you.
Yeah.
Maybe here in Australia, once we, roll out some of the more effective vaccines, things will change for the long term. But I think it's still too early to make that call definitively, as much as I hate to say it. And that's part of the problem for the world, to be completely honest with you. I mean, we're seeing this world at the moment where, food prices are skyrocketing. Where the food commodity index has risen to its highest level in 8 years, and it's continuing to rise significantly. And that's rising both because of temporary inflation, inflationary pressures, whether they're temporary or not, we'll see, but also because of supply chain issues, and also because of issues with, availability of crops, availability of raw foodstuffs. And all of this is going to create enormous problems in the developing world, which is completely ignored. Well, not completely, but more or less completely ignored, by the markets, by large swaths of the media, because really, who cares what happens to someone in Brazil or Myanmar or India or Nigeria or wherever? But the thing is, these people matter to the global economy. They like, I think we discussed this previously, but I sort of see it like the depression in reverse. Rather than having the problems on Wall Street spread into the rest of the world, we're going to see the problems in emerging markets spread into our world, because they don't have the trillions of dollars from Janet Yellen and, a Jay Powell furiously, printing his money.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And the latest intelligence on the impact of not getting the global things sorted out suggests that there would be quite a dent on that big GDP prize that there was a discussion quite recently about in the latest analysis. And the fact is that the markets have basically baked in a perfect recovery and escape from COVID, and the expectation that everything is going to go fine. Right? That's basically where the markets are at the moment. So anything that wobbles against that, anything that starts underscoring that things might not go quite as well, seem to me to be very much not priced in at the moment, and therefore that's why there's more downside than upside from where we currently are.
I agree, and I think that's part of the problem through all of this. I mean, people say, to people like you and myself that, it's like, oh, you guys are doomsayers, you got it all wrong, and it's like, did you guys just miss the trillions and trillions and trillions of extra stimulus that's been done since we made those calls at the start? At the start of the pandemic, did you miss the Biden, the Trump stimulus, the $900 billion and the other $1.9 trillion from Biden? Where do you think the economy would be without that? It's just like the same thing with JobKeeper. Where do you think we'd be if JobKeeper expired on time? Unemployment sure as hell wouldn't have a 5 in front of it. And just more broadly, we're starting to see the normalization of politics around funding and around fiscal spending, because Germany is now already leaning on the Spanish to say, oh, you guys really need to get this deficit under control. It doesn't matter that you've had like shed loads of businesses close and youth unemployment has a 3 and a 0 in front of it. That doesn't really matter. We've got to get this under control. And not only that, then there's also the political risk of the German elections coming up shortly. And there's the possibility, if polls are realised as of today, that the Greens, of all people, could end up in the Chancellor's office, which would just be hilarious. It's like, what do you think's going to happen without Merkel? And instead you've got the Greens. It's like, can you imagine what that's going to be like? Do you really think that the Greens are going to have the same level of fiscal prudence as Angela Merkel? That they're going to be able to say to the Greeks and the Spanish and the Italians and all the rest of the indebted countries of Southern Europe, oh, hey, yeah, no. Don't borrow all that money to bail out your economy. But we're allowed to bail out our economy and spend shed loads of money because we're different. How well did that work out last time for the Germans?
You took the words out of my mouth. Exactly right. Yes. And of course, Biden is now talking about lifting capital gains tax, lifting corporate taxes, starting to hint that, this stimulus, this largesse, is going to have to get paid for at some point in some way. And there are going to be segments of the population that aren't going to like that.
I just love how shocked everyone on Wall Street is today, to be honest. I love it. There's all these people going, oh, crap, there's going to be all these taxes, there's going to be, there's rumors going around on Wall Street from what I hear that there's going to be 80% tax on crypto profits. Now, I don't know how true that is or not, but, it wouldn't surprise me. Biden, when Biden sees Dogecoins, he sees dollars.
Yeah, and of course, there's the continued discussion about central bank digital currencies and how good they are and how they're prototyping them and testing them. The UK came out this week, the Bank of England, with a paper on that. We know that the Reserve Bank in Australia here is testing a CDBC not for retail use but for commercial use, and of course the Fed is exploring it in the US. So on one hand, they're talking up central bank digital currencies. On the other hand, they're continuing to rubbish cryptocurrencies, and Yellen's talking again about they're mostly used for money laundering and druggies and all those sorts of things. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all to suddenly say, oh well, let's bang a big tax on them and divert everybody into central bank digital currency land, which by the way can be controlled and manipulated and gives you a platform to be able to do negative interest rates and all the other things that you may need to do. There's a bunch of interesting questions there that people are only just beginning to wake up to.
I to be honest, I would have thought that all this stuff was pretty obvious. It's like, if you've got a very, very good digital currency or very, very good cryptocurrency, something say like Ethereum that has a whole bunch of different uses, that's becoming incredibly important to how a lot of companies do business in the digital world, and you're creating, a central bank digital currency, even though they're different, you're not going to want the competition. You're going to want them out of the space. Now, if crypto remains solely a gold type entity that's a store of value and not a competitor to traditional currency, then sure, they could coexist. Maybe they will. Maybe that will be what happens. I don't know. But if the line keeps getting pushed that it's an alternative to US dollars, Yellen's not going to like that. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing them push back slowly but surely, building the narrative. And because it's obviously going to take time to develop Fed coin or Yellen coin or whatever they're going to end up calling it, they're going to gradually just demonize crypto. And you're seeing that even now with crypto for the first time, as far as I'm aware, has become the subject of US sanctions towards Russia. And, I'm sure that they're going to end up linking all sorts of stuff to crypto in the future in order to demonize it. Now, I just want to just make one point before I end up just being burned alive in the comments. I don't agree with this. But at the end of the day, great powers do what great powers do. And none of us have any control over that.
No, that's right. So there is difficult to see, in my mind, how they can coexist. So central bank digital currencies and cryptocurrencies, right? And I know everybody says, well, one's controlled centrally and one's not controlled centrally. Well, the other is, one is actually controlling real money and the other is controlling something which may be having a value zero or zero infinity or somewhere in between, nobody knows, right? They are not the same. And there's quite clear to me that we are going to see heavy pressure from central banks. And of course, some countries, like Turkey, for example, have actually now banned cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, India's on their way to following them. And it's about control.
Yep.
Governments enjoy control mostly just because it stems from two things: a monopoly on currency and a monopoly on violence. And they will use the monopoly on violence in order to maintain the monopoly on currency. It's say, for example, it's even when people talk about abandoning the dollar, in terms of trade. If they're a big enough country like China or Russia, sure, they can get away with it. But when a little country does it, all of a sudden they find themselves under US sanctions. And then an aircraft carrier shows up. And, that's just the way the world works. Once again, I'm not saying that I endorse the way the world works in that particular fashion, but, you can expect people in power to defend their power.
Absolutely. Yes, people will defend their power, look after their own interests, look after their mates. And that's why the 1% loves what's going on at the moment, right? And not really have genuine concern for the majority of the population who, frankly, often are given the very damp end of the stick, to quote a phrase, unless, it somehow tips over into an election-related issue. But as I said earlier on, all you need is, enough to get voted in. You don't need everybody to agree with you. And that's the problem.
It is. It's a little bit of a tyranny of the majority sort of situation, unfortunately. it used to be. I mean, you used to have like people like Ronald Reagan. I know some people don't like Ronald Reagan, but he managed to win 49 out of 50 states. Can you imagine any politician in America, any person in America being able to step forward and win 49 out of 50 states? It's a complete impossibility. I mean, people are fighting almost to the death over whether or not the recent shooting of that teenage girl by that cop was justified because she was trying to stab someone with a knife. They can't, there's not even a broad agreement on something as simple as a single incident, let alone, a broader, consensus over, just politics in general. I think there's just this enormous division. And I mean, I got to be honest, like I sometimes I just imagine, President Xi sitting there in Beijing with a cigar and a nice bottle of brandy, just laughing his ass off. I mean, watching the US news must, like, if you're like an old Soviet psyops officer from the 80s, sitting in a retirement home in Novosibirsk or something like that, you're sitting there with your vodka watching TV just going, it worked. And then, it's just nuts. Yeah. I mean, I don't think in a million years they would have thought how easily they'd be able to, the Americans, to just eat each other.
No, well, I agree. And unfortunately, there's a lot more of that going to come, I think. And, the hard questions about what sort of society do we want, how do we support those less willing and able to come along, and how do we actually make the investments in the things that will take us to, strategically a place we want to get to, seem to me to be three questions that nobody wants to answer.
The thing that the elite need to realize is that you need a certain number of people in order to rule effectively. You need to pay sufficient lip service and provide a sufficient standard of living. And obviously that's changed dramatically over time, but you need to do that in order to maintain control. And you need to be able to just give people enough to have a stake in society to be able to just make it all work. That's something that's, at the core of political control since the beginning of humankind. Sometimes you use religion, say like the ancient Egyptians, or sometimes you use money like the Venetians. Everybody does it differently, but you need to somehow maintain a semblance of control over the people, give them a stake in society so they want the society to continue. But the problem is that's not what they're doing now. I mean, even the British in India were just like, well, we can't rule over all of this. We need to find a way to get the people on side. So they had their Maharajas, they had their feudal lords, they had all this power structure in order to do that. And that's what the elite need to do now. They need to create enough, what would you call it? Just enough political and social capital to continue the current system. But the problem is all they're doing is enriching the bloody 1%, and they can't seem to stop.
But I will also say that they are very, very good at manipulating stories, marketing, all those sorts of spinning stories left, right, and centre to try and actually sort of support their particular line of argument, irrespective of where the truth lies. So somewhere in all this, truth is being devalued as well.
Well, what do they say? I suppose it's a little bit like a war, isn't it? And truth is always the first casualty. It's like what Charles Barkley, the famous American basketballer, said the other day about race relations in America, that politicians benefit from the division. Because if we weren't so divided, fighting over cancel culture or whatever it is, we'd be talking about other things. Like say in America, they talk about all this stuff, all these people dying, all this and that, and I just feel like saying, it's like, do you know how many people die of preventable illnesses in America every year for lack of health insurance? It's like, why are we not talking about that? I mean, it's like, I think it was Philip Sues said it recently. He's like, you talk about the issues of race, but you don't talk about the issues of class. And in a lot of cases, people are divided more by class than they are by race. I mean, I'm not saying that racism isn't an issue and that race is not an issue. But in the daily lives of a lot of Americans, it's the fact that they can't afford health insurance on the streets of Los Angeles than it is that there is, some specific racism issue related to them in that moment.
Yeah. And, the old thought that I have is that there's often something called misdirection going on, right? So don't look over here, look over there, right? So there are some issues that they're quite happy to sort of spend time and effort and, the media cycle on. Quite often they're important issues, but are they the most critical issues? But over there's a bunch of issues that nobody wants to touch and talk about, right? In Australia, the property market will be a good example of that. There's a basic set of assumptions that, well, that's just the way it is. Now we'll go off and talk about something over there, right? And sometimes those big issues, those really critical issues, those issues that actually could make the difference between life and death for many people, or indeed, a better or worse life, just never get an airing. In a way that actually takes the conversation forward. And it goes right back to where we started this, the nanny state. And the nanny state is saying, we know best, we'll throw the money there, we'll do this, we'll protect you, we'll look after you, etc., etc. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for a considerable proportion of the population. And the net sum of all of this is a less good society than we might otherwise perhaps hope to see.
Well, I mean, I don't think it would be that controversial to say that if we didn't spend all this time and money diverting resources into the property market and into the finance sector, that Australia would be a better place. I don't think that is really all that debatable. You'd have more affordable housing, you'd have more businesses being viable because households had greater levels of disposable income. You'd have more people starting businesses because the banks wouldn't be so focusing on housing in order to generate returns. So, I mean, I think one of the really interesting and simultaneously frustrating things about Australia and just the world in general at this point is that the solutions are relatively simple. The thing that makes them difficult is politics.
Indeed, and you could argue, I think, that the Reserve Bank is politicised. In fact, in New Zealand, of course, now they've started to insert more pressure on the Reserve Bank from the political sphere to try and sort of push in a different direction. Don't see that here in Australia yet, but maybe we will. But, the fact is that those critical issues, the issues that really are of strategic importance, are the ones being pushed over to one side. And we're over here playing in a different sandpit, a sandpit which is controlled by a set of political messages that may work for some of the population. But nevertheless, it's, it's a little bit of an issue. So I think, Tarric, the conclusion from this conversation is the nanny should go home.
Yeah, that works. That works for me, mate. I mean, it'd be interesting. I mean, even if only for a moment, to see what Australia would look like without it. To be able to build a cubby house in the backyard for your kids without having to, deal with all this crap from the local council, or just to be able to see what the property market would look like standing on its own 2 feet without all of these enormous distortions, and the overhang of systemic risk.
Yep. Unfortunately, it's going to be a thought experiment at the moment. But it sounds quite attractive to me. So,
I was just going to say, unless you secretly have the backing of the military, I think we might be waiting a while.
Okay, well, let's start here. Nanny state, go home. Tarric, I appreciate your time today, as always. Significant thoughts, insights, as always, and I look forward to doing it again soon.
Yeah, me too, mate. Catch you later.
Cheers. Bye.